The teacher slid a blank board across Isaiah's desk in front of the entire class and whispered, "Prove you're not just a diversity seat." Phones recorded. Laughter echoed. No one stood up for him, but when Isaiah walked out that door, he wasn't running. He was loading something no one was ready for. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The room was unnaturally quiet for a Thursday morning. A glossy sunlight filtered through the high glass windows of Madison River Preparatory Academy's oldest classroom, a space meant for advanced futures, a course reserved only for seniors with perfect records and powerful connections. Rows of uniformed students sat with mechanical posture, notebooks open to clean pages, pens aligned with military precision. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was surgical. At the center of the room stood Mr. Edmund Carraway, a legacy professor who had taught at the academy for over 30 years. With his neatly pressed blazer, ivory cufflinks and permanent look of indifference, he was a figure of institutional pride and quiet fear. But today his expression curved ever so slightly as he paced toward the last row, where Isaiah Creed sat alone. Tall, reserved, and sharply intelligent, Isaiah had transferred into the academy 3 months ago on a full academic scholarship. It was the kind of move that disrupted silent codes, an outsider, especially a black one, entering a world meticulously designed to keep its walls high and its filters invisible. Mr. Carraway's leather shoes tapped against the floor, each step echoing in a room where even the sound of breath seemed offensive. Without a word, he placed a small, spotless whiteboard on Isaiah's desk. The gesture was slow, deliberate. The board gleamed with the kind of intimidating emptiness that dared to be filled. No marker, no instructions, just a blank surface, and a subtle smile from a man who had never once spoken Isaiah's name aloud. The professor's voice finally broke the silence, low, cold, and intentionally audible. Only to Isaiah, his words, though quiet, sliced through the room with surgical cruelty. Every student turned toward the back. Some feigned confusion, others stiffened in their seats, afraid to react, but fully aware of what they'd just witnessed. It was a ritual humiliation, wrapped in plausible deniability. No slurs, no yelling, just a blank board and a command only one person in the room was expected to earn. The air thickened. Isaiah's fingers didn't move right away. He stared at the board, then at the man towering above him. His eyes, dark and composed, showed no fear, just calculation. It wasn't just about today's class. It wasn't just about Mr. Carraway. This moment had been building, stacked like hidden weights over the past 12 weeks. The missed questions Isaiah never asked, but already knew. The group assignments he was mysteriously left out of. The polite laughter when he entered a room too early. Students around him glanced at one another, unsure whether to look sympathetic or silent. Some checked their phones under the desk. The seating chart had always placed Isaiah alone. Not just in the room but in the social order. He was brilliant, but brilliance didn't erase difference here. It highlighted it. Isaiah picked up the board with both hands, stood from his seat slowly, and the legs of his chair scraped the floor with a sharp screech that sliced through the classroom's tension, like a warning shot. Mr. Carraway took a subtle step back. There was no aggression in Isaiah's stance, only calm. But instead of responding with defiance or performance, Isaiah did something none of them anticipated. He walked past his desk, past the front row, past the instructor, whose smirk faltered just slightly. The room froze, not out of confusion, but because something unspoken had shifted. He wasn't just refusing to play, he was rewriting the rules. Isaiah's footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, as dozens of students remained inside, blinking in stunned silence. His blank board was still in hand, not thrown, not discarded, just held, as if it meant something more outside that room than it ever could within it. The door clicked shut behind him. No one followed. Inside, Mr. Carraway tried to continue class. He cleared his throat, redirected attention to the whiteboard at the front of the room. But the authority he once carried now felt hollow. Isaiah hadn't caused a scene, he had created a vacuum, one that sucked all legitimacy from the man who had once commanded the room with a glance. 15 minutes later, the classroom's calm began to fracture. One student in the back whispered, wondering aloud where Isaiah had gone. Another checked a group chat on their phone, only to see a blurry photo posted seconds earlier. Isaiah had walked past the media lab, and someone had captured the moment. Him holding the board like a symbol. No caption, just the image. The photo spread quickly. By the time the lunch bell rang, students in other buildings were passing it around. Rumors had already started forming. Some said Isaiah had stormed to the principal's office. Others claimed he'd left campus. A few even joked about rebellion. But beneath the mockery was something different: discomfort. Because what he had done wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Later that afternoon, one student, Amara Whitfield, the daughter of a tech CEO and one of the academy's most followed students on social media, posted the image with 4 words: "What did he prove?" That post went viral. The comment section exploded with speculation. Some praised Isaiah's restraint. Others ridiculed it. But no one ignored it. Teachers tried to quiet the storm. The administration issued no statement. But within 24 hours, a narrative began to twist itself into the digital fabric of the school's identity. Screenshots of Caraway's past surfaced. Evaluations, subtle reports, even anonymous confessions from alumni hinting at the same thing happening before. Suddenly, Isaiah wasn't just a student who walked out. He was a trigger, a catalyst, the mirror held up to an institution that prided itself on merit, but functioned on exclusion. And yet, while the campus buzzed and the world watched, Isaiah remained silent. He didn't respond to the post. He didn't return to school. He didn't message friends. His phone went dark. His presence vanished. Until one quiet night, something stirred. An anonymous account appeared online. It carried no profile picture, no bio, no name, just a post. It was an image of the blank board, now filled. But it wasn't words written on it. It was printed screenshots, emails, documents, grading rubrics. And at the bottom, "You wanted proof." The post was timestamped at 2. By 6:30 a.m., it had over 200,000 views. By 9 a.m., the school's official social media accounts were under attack, and by noon faculty inboxes were flooded with media requests. Isaiah hadn't left. He had just started writing. As the clock struck midnight the next day, a former student from 5 years earlier commented under the viral post, "This isn't the first time. I still have the audio." Isaiah's footsteps echoed long after he had vanished from the classroom. What should have been a forgettable Thursday at Madison River Prep instead twisted into a low-frequency storm that vibrated through the marble-floored corridors and gold-trimmed stairwells. From honors calculus to varsity locker rooms, whispers took root like invasive vines. Some students tried to laugh it off, calling it dramatic. Others stayed silent, sensing something deeper. But by the time the second period bell rang, Isaiah's name was already sliding across Snapchat stories like wildfire. No one saw where he went after leaving the classroom. He didn't return to his locker. Security footage would later confirm that he had bypassed the front lobby's exit and made a sharp turn down the old art wing, a rarely used hallway known more for storage than foot traffic. The security guard on duty claimed he didn't notice him pass by. Teachers didn't mark him absent, but what lingered was more than absence. It was the feeling that Isaiah had taken something with him, a silence so thick it unsettled even the most comfortable students in the school. Inside the cafeteria, the rumors began shaping into theories. Some said Isaiah had a mental breakdown. Others whispered he had been expelled mid-class for defiance. No official announcement came, which only deepened the intrigue. The few students who dared to ask faculty were met with rehearsed responses. "Let's focus on the lesson," or "That's not a discussion for students." Their dismissal was more telling than any truth. Silence in this place was not absence. It was control. At 12:06 p.m., the school's unofficial student-run gossip account posted a blurry photo of Isaiah's exit, snapped by a classmate seated 2 rows away. The image was dim, grainy, but unmistakable. Isaiah standing with the board in hand facing the door. The caption beneath it was simple: "Walked out. Didn't look back." Within minutes, the post had over 300 comments. Some mocked him. Others were uneasy. But many, quietly, cautiously, admitted something had felt off for weeks. Isaiah was too quiet, too sharp. He asked the kind of questions that didn't flatter the curriculum. He never laughed at the right jokes, never chased popularity, and never begged for approval. He was different, not because he was black, but because he didn't bend. By late afternoon, the story was evolving. Students began recalling past moments, microaggressions they'd ignored or laughed off. Small things, how Isaiah was always the one asked to speak from his perspective during uncomfortable topics, how he was passed over during group presentations, then marked down for not contributing enough, how his scholarship status was joked about in the locker room, how the faculty often referred to him with phrases like strong-willed or challenging tone, never gifted or innovative. But now, the walkout had created an opening. Not for accusation, but awareness. The image of him standing alone, holding the blank board like a shield, had pierced the school's carefully polished image. Isaiah hadn't yelled. He hadn't flipped a desk. He hadn't even protested, and still the institution was trembling. Outside of campus, the story stretched beyond private chat groups. Parents began texting each other. Faculty emails leaked among alumni. Local student-led activist pages picked up the photo. Madison River Prep, long considered an untouchable pillar of excellence, now had a thread loose, and people were pulling. But what happened next wasn't from students, or parents, or teachers. It came from Isaiah himself. At 11:43 p.m. that night, a new Instagram account posted a carousel of 3 images. The username was unrecognizable. No bio, no followers. But the first image was familiar. It was the blank board from earlier that day, propped against a faded concrete wall, now scrawled with text in thick black ink. Day 1. You wanted proof. The second image zoomed in on printed documents. Redacted names, faculty email chains, rubric notes. They detailed unusual grading changes, references to tone issues tied to Isaiah's work, and internal notes about how to monitor his engagement. The language was coded, but the pattern was clear. Isaiah was being tracked, not supported, not encouraged. The third image was a calendar. 10 days were circled, each with a single word written underneath. The first word, witness. The post's caption was chilling in its simplicity. Let's talk about who gets to belong. Within hours, the post was being screen recorded, reposted, analyzed, and by morning, the account had grown from 0 to 12,000 followers. Students who had once been too afraid to speak now sent anonymous DMs. Someone leaked a video from 2 years ago, a quiet recording of another black student being reprimanded during assembly for aggressive body language, while simply standing in line. The comments under Isaiah's post exploded, and still, Isaiah said nothing. No comments, no live video, no response to the chaos. He had started something massive, and walked away. But what turned the fire into an inferno wasn't the students. It was the faculty. An internal staff memo was accidentally leaked to a parent group, which was then posted online. In it, a senior administrator warned teachers to maintain professional narratives and to monitor any students showing signs of ideological influence. The memo described Isaiah's walkout not as an incident but as a potential disruption to the academic culture. The language was subtle, but the implications weren't. They were preparing to spin the story, to frame Isaiah as unstable, radical, unpredictable. But by the time they could act, it was too late. Because a former student, class of 2017, left a comment beneath Isaiah's post that changed everything. It read, "This isn't the first time. I still have the audio." No one knew her name. No one expected what she'd reveal. But her account, created only minutes after the comment, posted a single audio file. The caption, "They buried mine. Don't let them bury his." The voice in the recording wasn't hers. It was a teacher, laughing, saying Isaiah would never last here. He's smart, but not smart enough to be quiet. And then, in the background, unmistakable, the cold, precise voice of Mr. Carraway. The moment Isaiah hit post, the quiet of the night shattered. What began as a simple thread, a few screenshots, some redacted emails, a piece of audio, exploded across the internet. Overnight, his anonymous account became a beacon for truth. Within minutes, the first screenshot appeared. A grading spreadsheet with notes beside black students' names, words like tone issue, attitude risk, overly assertive. Below it, an excerpt from a faculty meeting memo. Maintain cohort balance, do not overload with dissenters. Then a scanned page of recommendation tier rankings, names color-coded, with tiers that correlated disturbingly cleanly with skin tone. Under each file, Isaiah wrote nothing more than, "See." At 2:13 a.m., the fire began. The post had less than 100 followers. By 3:00 a.m., the first repost had landed. A student-run Zoom group, captioned, "What if we've all been grading racism?" By dawn, the thread had been duplicated across platforms, annotated and translated. Screenshots flooded group chats in other prep schools, public high school forums, historically black colleges, even faculty lounges. The leak had bypassed the filter of silence. It had burst into the open, unasked, undeniable. On campus, the reaction was immediate, electric. By mid-morning, students whispered in hallways, passed phones under desks, whose dealers wore masks of confusion and fear. Teachers checked their email inboxes like guilty conspirators, seeing red flags where only routine memos had resided before. Administrators tried to act calm, official statements drafted, PR consultants reached, reassurances promised, but the tremor was visible. Provosts closing office doors, mid-meeting, security guards pacing near faculty parking lots, counselors asked to file extra reports. They knew, and they feared what was spilling out. Parents logged on. Alumni scrolled through feeds. Articles appeared within hours on both major education outlets and fringe blogs. A headline read, "Inside the data leak. Has privilege become the new GPA at elite schools?" Another, "When excellence is conditional. Grading justice for Black students." The school's pristine online brochures, glossy photos of diverse students in civies laughing under oak trees, looked suddenly empty, hollow shells of marketing. The image had stopped convincing even the faithful. Messages flooded Isaiah's anonymous inbox. Former Black students shared memories, nights when they'd stayed up studying alone, ignored by study groups, parents forced to withdraw tuition quietly, suppressed essays, downgraded rubrics, explanationless disciplinary warnings. Each story bore the same painful rhythm: hope, talent, silence, erasure. Each added weight to the growing pile of exposure. Soon a shared archive formed: documents, testimonies, redacted report cards, a digital graveyard of academic injustice. Within 24 hours, the school's administrative servers began to emit warnings. Unusual download patterns, data leaks suspected, logs flagged, but it was too late. The documents had already fled, replicated, mirrored again. The leak had become viral. The truth was not just out, it was unstoppable. By the following morning, a barrage began. Board members issued guarded statements praising diversity and equity, and pledging internal review. Faculty lines went dark. Teachers scheduled emergency training and locked staff-only portals. Counselors circulated memos advising students to focus on academics, not social media noise. Every official communication was carefully sterile. No names, no accusations, no mention of race. Silence dressed up as procedure. Still, the posts continued to spread. One blog post compared the leaked grading data to historical redlining maps, showing correlation between neighborhoods and academic outcomes, demonstrating that the racial filters used by the school mirrored broader societal biases. Another Twitter thread mapped out migration patterns of graduates, showing that Black students disproportionately ended up in low-paying unpaid internships or community college routes, regardless of GPA. The evidence painted not just a scandal, but a systemic structural perfected over decades. At lunchtime, students who had never spoken now clustered at tables, quietly showing each other their copies of the files. Faces darkened. One white student stared at a screen for so long her phone glowed in her palm until the battery drained. Another jotted notes in a notebook, as though preparing for something beyond class. The atmosphere was heavy, like everyone sensed the walls of the institution were cracking, and even those who still believed in its promise could feel the debris shaking their faith. Administrators responded with action. Security cameras were repositioned. Student-run devices were prohibited on campus. Email filters tightened. Faculty laptops were confiscated for audit. But the damage was done. Not just to data, to identity. Identity of students who had been told they belonged, only to find that belonging was conditional. Identity of a school that had sold itself as merit-based excellence, but operated as racial equilibrium management. The public marketplace of truth had exposed the lie. Late that afternoon, amid the chaos, a cryptic comment appeared under Isaiah's original thread, from a user named Legacy12. The message was short, chilling. This isn't the first time. It wasn't an explanation. It was a tear in the veil. For days, nothing more appeared, but the implication was seismic. If this wasn't the first time, then how many times? How many students had been judged by tone, instead of grades? How many Black scholars quietly filtered out? How many anonymous complaints had triggered drugging, transfers, silencing? The comment was a dare, a warning, a promise of deeper rot. In the following hours, hundreds of replies appeared beneath it, but none from Legacy. Instead, a flood of new voices, other alumni, teachers, parents began posting fragments, grade sheets, class photos with suspicious missing student edits, emails warning families not to press the issue. The thread became a living archive of institutional horror, curated not by investigators, but by survivors. The school's attempts to scrub the files only amplified them. Each time a document link was deleted, 3 more appeared. Each time a name was censored, Someone else spoke up, with their own story. The leak had become a pipeline of truth. Raw, unfiltered, unavoidable. At night, after the sun had gone down, Isaiah sat in his room. The hum of his laptop, the only constant. He watched as the follower count climbed, as new platforms reposted, as voices chimed in. He didn't feel triumph. He felt responsibility, the weight of every student who had suffered silence, every record erased, every promise broken. Yet in the midst of growing chaos, a thought settled in him with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just a school scandal anymore. It was a national vision, one that forced society to confront how privilege masks prejudice, how excellence masks exclusion, and how institutions can weaponize their own credibility to suppress dissent. And just when it seemed his post had exposed everything, a new message appeared on his screen. A private one. No username, no profile, no history. Just a blank slate and a single line. Look up old student site. Class list 208. Tutoring roster. Missing black names. Isaiah leaned forward. His heart pounded. The screen glowed softly in the dark. He opened the attachment. Thousands of names, dates, course codes, and scores. But beside more than 100 entries were 2 words typed in red. Erased and report. Silence filled the room. Then the screen flickered. He realized the thread hadn't just cracked open the institution. It had begun unraveling decades of careful illusion. Isaiah's eyes widened as the cursor hovered over the next file, labeled only 208 2012 Black Enrollment Audit. Full data. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. Outside somewhere, the school's legacy quietly began to unravel, and he was holding the match. The voice in the leaked recording, so casual, so cold, had changed the tone of the conversation overnight. The quiet laughter, the mockery, and that one unmistakable line spoken with surgical precision by Mr. Carraway had pierced through Madison River Prep's polished facade, like a scalpel through silk. For years, the school had built its brand on exclusivity masked as excellence, diversity marketed as decor, and discipline dressed in the language of refinement. But now, their silence was no longer a tool of control. It was an indictment. Within hours of the audio surfacing, a ripple effect spread through platforms far beyond the student body. Alumni from various graduating classes began to comment under Isaiah's post. Some used their real names. Others, wary of retaliation, created anonymous accounts. But one by one they began to speak. Each memory shared wasn't just a recollection, it was a confession long buried, a wound left to fester beneath layers of academic prestige and silent endurance. One alum recalled being pulled aside after a debate competition and told his aggressive tone made the judges uncomfortable, despite having won on merit. Another recounted how her counselor had dissuaded her from applying to certain Ivy League schools because she might not fit the culture. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. Subtle acts of containment wrapped in academic language, always just quiet enough to escape documentation. The comments multiplied, not in rage, but in weary detail. There were recollections of black students never being cast in lead theater roles, even with superior auditions, of disciplinary actions issued disproportionately, often for vague infractions, like disruptive energy or non-compliance with tone. There were reminders of how black students were photographed more often for marketing brochures, yet less likely to be nominated for student government. Every story chipped at the once untouchable image of Madison River Prep, not by exposing some grand scandal, but by revealing a slow, calculated culture of erasure. Then came the photos. A graduating senior from 2 years ago posted a screenshot of an old yearbook proof. The same page printed twice, side by side. One version, which had made it to print, showed a diverse group smiling in front of the science building. The other, never released, had a photo replaced. A black student had been digitally removed, her image replaced with a stock photo of a lab beaker. The student in question had withdrawn before graduation, under vague circumstances. Until that post, no one had noticed she had vanished from the official record. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Isaiah. It wasn't even just about Carraway. The legacy of the institution itself was under scrutiny. For decades, Madison River had shaped leaders, lawmakers, CEOs, but now the institution was being asked to answer for what it did to those who didn't fit the mold. Some alumni tried to defend the school, posting about their positive experiences, but even those posts began unraveling. A 2005 graduate, now a state prosecutor, shared that during his time at the academy, black students were informally tracked into certain electives, sports media instead of international law, conflict resolution instead of economics. These choices made subtly had long-term consequences. College applications, recommendation letters, even internships were affected. It wasn't just bias. It was design. Then, one voice stood out. Not an alumnus, not a student. A former teacher. Her name appeared without fanfare, buried among the comments. She had taught literature at the academy until 2014, and had since moved to another district. In her message she wrote only one sentence. Check your inbox. Subject line. The unseen curriculum. Isaiah, still operating through anonymous channels, received the message just before dawn. Attached was a file, simple in appearance, heavy in weight. Its contents weren't just notes or personal reflections. They were internal documents, obtained during her final year at the academy. Memos, staff meeting summaries, and coded faculty guides on cultural temperament management. The language was academic, clinical, almost neutral, but the implications were anything but. There was a matrix used during evaluations, categorizing students not just by academic performance, but by perceived behavioral risks. Terms like elevated intensity, non-traditional family support, and cultural dissonance were used, euphemisms for race, class, and background. Black students overwhelmingly were flagged more frequently. These designations weren't disclosed to parents or students, but they influenced everything: how teachers interacted, how counselors advised, how opportunities were distributed or withheld. Buried in the middle of the document was a section titled Pathways of Containment. It listed behavioral strategies for redirecting high-energy students of urban backgrounds, a phrase so coded it barely concealed its meaning. The suggestions included limiting their time in collaborative group roles, redirecting conversations that challenged lesson structures, and escalating minor behavioral disruptions to reinforce compliance. These were not written by a rogue teacher. They were official recommendations, reviewed and circulated. The final page contained a chilling line, circled by the former teacher before she forwarded it to Isaiah. Visibility without influence is our balance. It wasn't just a strategy, it was a philosophy, a quiet mantra that had governed the school for years. Allow diversity in appearance, but suppress it in power. Isaiah's hands trembled as he scrolled through the file. The rage he felt wasn't loud. It was surgical, the kind of anger that builds not from shock, but from recognition. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Every dismissal, every condescending smile, every moment he was told to adjust his tone. It hadn't been about behavior. It had been a strategy, an engineered silence. He uploaded parts of the document within hours. Redacted, careful, but damning. The reaction was immediate. Faculty members went dark. The official school account deleted comments. News blogs picked up the story. Education watchdog groups requested interviews. But Isaiah remained in the shadows, watching the storm build from a distance. By the afternoon he noticed something strange. The original post had begun glitching. Comments disappeared. His account was flagged for potential misinformation. Screenshots of his uploads were being removed for violating vague community guidelines. The story somehow was being throttled. And then the twist. A message popped into the anonymous inbox. Not from a student, not from a teacher, but from someone claiming to work inside the school's legal department. The message contained no greeting, no threats, just one line. They knew this might happen. Look for the second file. They never destroyed it. Attached was a password-protected file, its name simple, chilling and impossible to ignore. NIA Case 2. The document titled NIA Case 2019 Te Bet opened like a sealed vault, the contents inside thick with tension and unspoken truths. It wasn't just a file, it was a blueprint of how power preserved itself beneath the polished surface of Madison River Prep. For Isaiah, each page didn't just sting, it confirmed every invisible bruise he and others had been forced to carry in silence. But it was what followed, the file labeled, The Unseen Curriculum, that broke past exposure and stepped into revelation. The file was divided into 3 sections, each more damning than the last. At first glance it looked like internal data, graphs, student performance metrics, faculty recommendations. But Isaiah, with the sharp eyes of someone who had long been trained to read between the lines, saw something far more insidious. The data wasn't neutral, it was coded. An erase, though never mentioned explicitly, lived in every chart, in every label, in every carefully constructed category. The first section focused on grading consistency. with teacher evaluations cross-referenced against demographic breakdowns. In class after class, Black students were marked down for incomplete analysis, lack of depth, or overly personal tone, even when their assignments exceeded rubric expectations. Conversely, white students who submitted nearly identical content were praised for original interpretation or risk-taking perspectives. These weren't occasional errors. They were patterns, clean, precise, repeated across departments and instructors over 5 years. Isaiah's stomach twisted as he read the internal annotations written by teachers. Lines like "needs structure, too passionate," or "lacks academic polish" were used disproportionately for Black students. The comments masqueraded as objective but functioned as silencers, shaping not just grades but self-perception. The effect was systemic. Even students with identical test scores were funneled into different outcomes, depending on how palatable their presence was in the classroom. But the second section cut deeper. Titled "Recommendation Tiering," it exposed an unspoken hierarchy that explained the subtle disparity in post-graduation opportunities. The system grouped students into coded categories that mirrored college counselor priorities. Tier A for elite outreach, Tier B for regional fit, Tier C for alternate track. What looked like harmless administrative planning was anything but. Beneath the labels were descriptors that tied directly to racial assumptions. Tier A students were flagged with terms like legacy eligible, network family, or culturally fluid. Tier C students were branded with limited external support, adjustment risk, and social reinforcement needed, sanitized language hiding racially loaded judgments. Isaiah scanned the names. Most Tier A students were white. A few Asian American. Almost no Black students. The implication was clear. Potential wasn't about performance. It was about perception. And perception, within these walls, was a quiet algorithm of exclusion. The final section was what left Isaiah frozen. A faculty training guide. A 70-page slide deck used during staff development retreats. It was titled "Equity Through Structure: Managing Varied Learning Temperaments." It was cloaked in the language of support, even advocacy. But the content was engineered with surgical racism. Slides highlighted how to preemptively redirect misaligned energies, how to balance classroom cultural tensions, and how to protect curriculum integrity. The language was polished, but the intent was chilling. One section showed classroom seating strategies designed to optimize interaction. Black students, it was suggested, should not be seated in adjacent rows to avoid reinforcement cycles. Isaiah couldn't breathe for a full minute. The truth wasn't just that racism existed in the system. It was that the system itself was designed to keep racism invisible. Polished, worded through policy, reinforced by data, and cloaked in professionalism. And now he was holding the blueprint of it all. But with that power came something heavier. Risk. Isaiah knew that uploading this file wouldn't just burn the administration. It would implicate faculty who had smiled at him, who had shaken his hand, who had told him to keep pushing. He also knew that some of these teachers were no longer at Madison River, and some were now district heads, policy advisors, Ivy League professors. This wasn't just about one school. It was about a machine. Still, silence was no longer an option. He began compiling a new post. Unlike his earlier leaks, this one required precision. He stripped names, cross-verified numbers, layered each slide with timestamps and source context. His goal wasn't vengeance. It was exposure. He knew the weight of what he was about to do. He also knew the cost. Students would be pulled into investigations. Parents would be called. Reputations would collapse. But it wasn't his story alone anymore. It belonged to every Black student who had sat in those classrooms and been told they weren't a good fit for leadership, or that their ideas were unrefined. By nightfall, Isaiah published the thread under the same anonymous account. He titled it "The Unseen Curriculum." The thread began with a question. What does academic racism look like when it wears a tie? Each tweet revealed a layer, a chart, a memo, a recommendation matrix, stitched together like a puzzle no one could ignore. By midnight, the thread had surpassed 2 million views. Hashtags trended. Faculty from other schools joined the conversation. Whistleblowers from different districts began posting similar patterns. The story had outgrown the school. It had become a movement. But not everyone watched silently. At 4:16 a.m., a message appeared in Isaiah's inbox, this time not anonymous. It was from the school's legal department, polite in tone, firm in intent. It informed him that the uploaded content constituted unauthorized distribution of proprietary material, and that continuing such activity would trigger immediate legal consequences, including potential defamation liability. The letter ended with a veiled suggestion: cease posting, and perhaps a discussion could be arranged. It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that even truth, when spoken without permission, becomes dangerous. Isaiah read the message twice. The words didn't frighten him. They clarified everything. The school wasn't denying the documents. They were protecting the machinery behind them. But what the legal team didn't know, what they hadn't accounted for, was that Isaiah wasn't the only one holding evidence now. Because hours earlier, an unexpected email had landed in his encrypted inbox. Its sender, a former vice principal who had quietly resigned in 20. No greeting, no explanation, just a subject line. This is what they buried with Nia. Attached was a 22-second audio file, the last counseling session transcript, of a missing student whose name hadn't been spoken on campus in 3 years, until now. The email landed in Isaiah's inbox with no subject line and no traceable sender, but its impact was immediate. There were no words of context, no explanations, just a clipped sentence typed at the center of the page. You are expected tomorrow, 8:15 a.m., 39 Alder Lane, bring nothing, tell no one. Beneath it, a Madison River administrative seal faintly watermarked the message, almost like a signature too ashamed to be legible. Isaiah stared at it for a long time. There was no point in asking what this was. It wasn't a request. It was a summons, not to the school office or a disciplinary room. This address was off campus, outside of policy, outside of protocol. And yet, unmistakably, the message bore the handprint of authority. He recognized it immediately, the kind of pressure that was never written on paper but always understood. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. By the next morning, fog hovered low over the streets, swallowing the street signs and muting every sound. Isaiah walked the blocks in silence, dressed plainly, with nothing in his hands, no phone, no notebook, no devices. The address led him to a narrow brick building that didn't carry the aesthetics of power. No flags, no signs, no plaques. But as he reached the entrance, a security-grade metal door buzzed open before he could even knock. They were watching. Inside, the building felt colder than the outside. The hallway lights flickered weakly as he was silently led down a long corridor by a man in plain clothes. Not security, not staff, just someone with the detached demeanor of a courier. He didn't ask Isaiah for identification. He didn't speak. He simply opened a door and gestured. The room was small and windowless, its air stale and heavy with an artificial citrus scent, meant to mask something older. At the center sat a round table. 3 people were already there. The principal, Dr. Havenridge, with her characteristic tight-lipped expression, Miss Haraway, whose smug restraint hadn't cracked since the walkout, and a third man Isaiah had never seen before. Older, sharp-suited, and observing him with the kind of quiet menace that said nothing and promised everything. No camera, no recording devices, no notes, just a table, 3 people, and a student being asked to sit without being told why. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, it was surgical. No raised voices, no accusations, but Isaiah felt it immediately. This wasn't a meeting, this was a containment procedure. Each sentence offered by the administrators was dressed in calm language, but it carried barbs, reminders that his actions had gone beyond acceptable boundaries, that he had undermined professional trust, that shared interests required cooperation. The words floated in the air like sweetened poison, carefully calibrated to sound reasonable, while pressing down like invisible chains. What disturbed him most wasn't the subtle threat. It was the ease with which they framed his silence as dangerous, his exposure as betrayal. They spoke of community and unity, of misunderstandings that could be resolved with discretion. But behind every statement was the same unspoken condition. Stop. Pull the post. Vanish the documents. Return to your desk, your role, your silence, and we'll pretend none of this ever happened. Isaiah didn't flinch, didn't speak. His stillness was its own resistance. The third man leaned forward then, and his expression sharpened. His words came more direct, even without being spoken aloud, the kind of tone that made you feel like a lawsuit had just stepped into the room. Isaiah didn't need to hear specifics. The threat was legal and personal, financial, reputational, and relentless. They didn't have to expel him. They would erase him in more efficient ways. But then something unexpected happened. From across the table, one of the teachers, a younger instructor, Isaiah barely remembered, someone who had taught him briefly during a freshman workshop, shifted slightly in her chair. No one had introduced her, and she hadn't spoken a word since Isaiah entered. But now, her hand moved beneath the table, quick and deliberate. With a single motion, Subtle enough to escape the eyes of those seated beside her, she slid something across to Isaiah's leg. It was a small black USB. She never made eye contact, never acknowledged the gesture. Her body language remained neutral, her gaze fixed on the blank wall opposite her. But in that moment, something cracked in the silence. Not an outburst, not a rebellion, but a fracture in the control they thought they had. Isaiah kept his face still, barely shifting his leg, as he caught the device with 2 fingers. It vanished into his coat pocket in one fluid motion. No one noticed. No one questioned. The meeting continued, but its rhythm faltered. The principal's words began to lose their coherence, as if even she sensed that something had shifted. Caraway kept his smirk, but it now twitched at the edges. The man in the suit grew more assertive, but Isaiah could hear the undertone of urgency in his voice. They were pushing harder now, faster, as though aware their grip was slipping. They dismissed him with a tone that suggested it was his decision to walk away. He left without a word. Outside, the fog had thickened. It pressed against his skin like a warning. Isaiah didn't return home. Instead, he ducked into the back of a small corner cafe, ordered nothing, sat in the farthest booth, and pulled out his laptop. The USB clicked into place. It wasn't a collection of new documents. It was a video, grainy, time-stamped from 2 years earlier. A classroom, a student standing, a teacher yelling, not with rage, but with that familiar tone of discipline, sharpened by bias. The student was a girl, young, black. Her hands were at her sides, her expression unreadable. Isaiah froze. He recognized her. It was Nia, the same name on the encrypted case file sent days earlier. The audio kicked in. She was being accused of plagiarism. Not because the assignment was identical to another, but because, as the teacher said in the recording, it was too advanced for someone like you. The room had gone silent after that line. The teacher resumed class, as if nothing had been said. Nia never responded. She simply sat down. The timestamp showed that she had withdrawn from the school 1 week later. No record of a formal complaint. No investigation. Just absence. Isaiah stared at the screen for a long time, his reflection flickering in the dim glow of the footage. This wasn't just about him anymore. This had been happening long before he arrived. On the video's final frame, a hidden caption flickered for a split second, auto-generated by the surveillance system. It read, "File copied to admin archive, 1 view remaining." Isaiah's hands trembled as he replayed the final frame of the surveillance footage. That blinking line, "File copied to admin archive, 1 view remaining," wasn't just a glitch. It was a warning. Somewhere, the school still held a copy. Somewhere, the evidence of Nia's silencing, her humiliation, and the soft-spoken abuse caught in that cold classroom lens was waiting to be erased, permanently. He didn't move for several minutes. The world outside the cafe window kept drifting, unaware, uncaring. But inside, Isaiah's mind was alight with calculation. That USB hadn't just dropped a bombshell. It had also cracked open a hidden door in the institution's machine. And what lay beyond that door was more than data. It was a war room. Isaiah copied the entire folder to an encrypted drive, then inspected the directory tree on the USB. Buried under a folder titled Staff Orientation Archives was a smaller, password-protected file. It was nondescript. No capital letters, just one word: lounge. When he decrypted it, the screen dimmed for a heartbeat, and then opened to something that felt darker than anything else he'd seen so far. It wasn't official documents or sanitized memos. It was raw, unfiltered, a massive dump of internal staff group chats, screenshots, logs, timestamps, private conversations between faculty members, archived for unknown reasons. What should have been casual staff coordination, lunchroom schedules, carpool arrangements, club signups, unraveled into something much more corrosive. The first few pages were mundane, almost too ordinary, like bait designed to lull a reader into thinking it was all innocent. But then the language shifted. One thread was titled Student Culture Watch. Within it, a series of instructors shared notes on which students to keep eyes on. Isaiah's name appeared 6 times, always paired with the same coded terms: elevated posture, tone-prone, possible external influence. Further down, the language stopped pretending. A conversation from a Friday evening staff group chat turned from discussing grade submissions to mocking student names. A black student was called "urban fiction come to life." Another comment responded with laughing emojis. One teacher questioned whether a girl with a creative hair wrap was in dress code. Someone replied, cultural expression, more like cultural disruption. No one objected. Isaiah's throat tightened as he read the date. That conversation took place the night before the school's annual diversity celebration. There were jokes made about DI fatigue, complaints about students who pull the race card when their GPAs drop, and one thread screenshot from a phone camera mocking Isaiah's board walkout. The caption read, "Blank board, blank brain, but hey, he'll probably get a BuzzFeed internship from it." The laughing reactions outnumbered the message itself, but it was worse than mockery. One thread, marked Private Faculty Council, discussed how to limit activist-type momentum without triggering formal complaints. They referenced students from volatile home dynamics, those prone to community instability, and non-legacy disruptors. Every phrase was tailored to evade accountability while hitting its target. And then came the tipping point. An older message, dated 2 years prior, revealed a planning conversation about quota management. It wasn't overt, but the implication was unmistakable. Discussions about reducing incoming Black scholarship students by revising test scoring filters and incorporating soft character criteria to balance the cohort for cohesion. The final line of that thread sent Isaiah into stillness. It read, "Let's keep the balance manageable. Too many, and we'll lose the tone of the place." The word tone again. Not voice. Not behavior. Not culture. Tone. That single syllable had haunted Isaiah since he first entered Madison River's walls, and now it stood before him not as a theory, but as policy. As he documented the logs, Isaiah knew that this wasn't just institutional racism, it was engineered, layered, hidden beneath policies that could never be challenged in court, but always executed in practice. A system designed to make Black excellence look like aggression, Black identity feel like disruption, and Black presence seem like overreach. He compiled everything, hundreds of screenshots, full transcripts, context trails. He watermarked them, encrypted them, and sent copies to 5 anonymous Dropboxes across different platforms. This story wouldn't disappear. Not now, not ever. But just as he uploaded the final batch, his phone vibrated. A silent ping, no sender, just one line. Delete everything. They know. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Isaiah's entire body went cold. In the seconds that followed, he noticed things he hadn't before. A black SUV had passed the cafe 3 times in the last hour. A man in a dark coat across the street hadn't touched his coffee once. The camera on his laptop flickered briefly. Even though he had taped it earlier, he was no longer just a student, exposing a broken system. He was a threat, a target. He shut the laptop, grabbed his bag, and exited the back alley without hesitation. The streets felt tighter now. The air, heavier. Every parked car, every idle glance, it all buzzed with the possibility of surveillance. Not from strangers. From within. Isaiah knew what was happening. They were activating containment mode. Not through police, not through open threats, but through the soft violence of academic warfare, reputation erasure, digital sabotage, academic expulsion without announcement, social blacklisting. He took a longer route home, switching transit lines 3 times. Before he entered his building, he powered down every device and placed them in a shielded pouch. He had exposed their words. Now they would try to make him look like the one out of line. But they had already made their mistake, because what they failed to realize was that Isaiah hadn't just saved the files. He'd shared them with someone unexpected. A student on the inside. A white student. A popular one. The kind they would never suspect. The final upload on Isaiah's backup drive showed a new file being added, not by him, but remotely. Its name was simple, haunting, and newly created. Last year's incident NAA final.wov. The first time Isaiah noticed it, it was so small it almost didn't register. A tiny blinking light, nestled behind a spare textbook in his locker, disguised as a standard adhesive hook. It flickered once, then again, a brief glint in the metallic shadows. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a trick of the light, but when he reached for it, his fingers met something hard, embedded. It was a device, a camera, thin, wireless and freshly installed. He didn't breathe. Instead, his eyes scanned the hallway like a hunted animal stepping into a trap already sprung. Students laughed and passed by without noticing. Everything looked normal, but the air was wrong, too controlled, too quiet beneath the usual noise. Isaiah placed the device in his sleeve, shut his locker, and walked away like nothing had happened. But inside, every alarm in his mind screamed. That night, inside his room, he dismantled the device with surgical precision. It wasn't a regular camera. It was school-issued tech traceable to a district security system used only for official surveillance. Someone had planted it inside his personal locker, someone with keys, access, and authority. The implications weren't just invasive, they were illegal. Isaiah's next move was surgical. He pulled up the archived campus security feed, using a private backdoor he'd built weeks ago. For months he had watched the administration's patterns, tracking how they operated in shadows, disciplining students without paperwork, shifting meeting times off record, and slipping warnings behind smiles. But nothing prepared him for what he found that night. There it was, clear as day. Footage from 2 days prior. 2 school administrators, one holding a black device in his palm, the other standing watch. They moved with purpose, timing their action between class periods. No hesitation, no doubt. One opened Isaiah's locker with a master key, placed the camera, adjusted its angle, then closed it again. It was recorded, time-stamped, stored, and it was undeniable. They were watching him, not through policies or grade reports, but through his personal space, his private moments, not because he'd broken rules, but because he had broken silence. But the surveillance was only the surface. Over the next 2 weeks, Isaiah began noticing new patterns. Teachers who once nodded at him in the hallway now looked away. His class participation dropped in value on rubrics without explanation. In one class, he submitted a full-length research project on systemic education bias. The feedback came back blank. No comments, just a grade slashed lower than any he'd received before. Another teacher accused him of failing to meet tone expectations, a phrase that now carried more weight than any letter grade. He wasn't failing, but he was being failed. And then came the public pivot. A counselor, one he had never spoken with, requested a wellness check. The school released a vague note to faculty, subtly painting Isaiah as under emotional duress and in need of peer patience and professional support. It was worded with care, like concern, but its function was crystal clear: manufacture instability, frame his outrage as breakdown. Not activism, but unraveling. Whispers spread. The same students who had once reposted his thread now looked at him with guarded eyes. A few even kept their distance, murmuring that he was getting paranoid. One teacher insinuated in class that stress sometimes warps memory, while another suggested students double-check facts before joining digital mobs. No names were used. They didn't have to be. Isaiah saw what was happening. This wasn't punishment, it was character assassination. Bit by bit, the school was turning his courage into a cautionary tale. But just as the noose tightened, a break arrived from the most unexpected place. It was after school, late evening, when a message slid into his anonymous inbox. A voice he never anticipated. Not from a whistleblower, not from a victim, but from someone standing on the other side of the line. A white student. Popular, respected, from a long-standing Madison River family. The kind the school adored. The message was brief, cautious, and filled with the guilt of someone who had seen too much for too long. He claimed he had watched the locker surveillance unfold live that day, standing down the hall as the administrators worked. He said nothing at the time. Fear made him quiet. But what broke him wasn't the act. It was the aftermath. The way the faculty spoke about Isaiah in staff lobbies, in private lunches, the way they laughed at his meltdown posts, predicted how long he'd last before disappearing, and compared his outspokenness to performance theater. But it wasn't just what he'd heard, it was what he'd recorded. The student claimed he had audio, not just of one moment, but of months of conversations, gathered by accident, saved by conscience. He had pieced it together, unsure what to do. But now, watching Isaiah's reputation crumble while truth sat caged in his own pocket, he was ready to act. He wanted to meet. He wouldn't say where. Not yet. Just one line closed the message. I have what they buried last year. And her name was Nia. Isaiah stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a countdown. The student wasn't just coming forward. He had the missing piece, and it was about to make everything undeniable. The message sat in Isaiah's inbox like a live wire, pulsing, dangerous, but filled with the possibility of something explosive. From the moment he read the line, her name was Nia, the rhythm of his breath changed. It wasn't just that a student, especially one protected by status and privilege, had spoken up. It was that he had spoken the name the administration had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. Nia wasn't a rumor anymore. She was the key. Isaiah didn't respond right away. He watched the message over and over, examining each word like a code. The student hadn't offered credentials, hadn't attached files, Just the promise of evidence and a willingness to risk everything. It was the kind of gamble only someone from the inner circle could afford to make. But the weight of what it meant wasn't lost on Isaiah. This was the first time someone from the safe side of the system was willing to bleed. The meeting was set at dusk, away from campus, in a park with enough open air to see trouble coming, and enough silence to know when trust was being tested. Isaiah arrived early, pacing by the edge of the field, watching shadows stretch across benches and stone paths. When the student finally appeared, Isaiah recognized him instantly. Gavin Holloway, varsity tennis captain, student council treasurer, son of a wealthy donor whose name was engraved in the school's library rotunda. A face that graced brochures, a name whispered with respect. The last person anyone would suspect to turn against the institution that had protected him his entire life. Gavin didn't walk like someone doing a favor. He moved like someone carrying something heavy. Without a word, he pulled a flash drive from the inside pocket of his jacket and extended it toward Isaiah with a hand that didn't shake but eyes that couldn't meet his. Inside the drive was a folder titled Last Year's Incident, and beneath it subfolders with time-stamped files, labeled not with names but with classroom numbers, teacher initials and dates. Gavin explained, not with words but with posture, that he had been a silent witness for too long. A year ago he'd been sitting in an adjacent room when he overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear, a discussion between faculty members about redirecting Nia's influence before it compromised academic balance. He didn't understand it then, but when Nia disappeared from campus weeks later, everything began to unravel inside him. He had saved things. Screenshots of faculty group messages. Airdropped files he wasn't supposed to receive. Even partial audio clips captured from hallway mics, where jokes and warnings slipped out from teachers in unguarded moments. But fear had sealed his mouth. Until now, Isaiah took the flash drive without speaking. But inside, something ruptured. It wasn't relief. It was validation wrapped in fury. Proof that the machine didn't just consume students like him. It used others as insulation. It used silence as camouflage. The files were worse than Isaiah anticipated. One showed Nia's counseling session logs, with notes referring to her overconfidence, her cultural assertiveness, and peer influence potential. The counselor had recommended limiting her leadership opportunities and placing her in courses with higher behavioral structure. Another document revealed a message thread where her name had been flagged for excessive classroom questioning. It wasn't an intervention, it was containment. But the final folder struck hardest. It included screenshots of a faculty conversation that occurred 3 days before Nia's abrupt disappearance. One teacher had written that Nia was beginning to pull other girls into her ideology, and that she was clearly organizing something. Another responded, "We need to kill the momentum before it becomes another movement. Kill the momentum. Not address it. Not engage. Kill." The words replayed in Isaiah's mind like a drumbeat of institutional violence. These weren't the words of educators. They were the tools of suppression disguised as mentorship. And then came the unexpected twist. Among the files Gavin handed over was an anonymous tip email sent to the administration just weeks before Nia was removed from the student body. The sender had warned the school about radicalizing behavior and underground organizing. The email was unsigned, but the metadata remained. Isaiah traced it. The IP address came from inside the school, and not just from any device. It belonged to a faculty laptop, registered to Mr. Caraway. Isaiah's pulse spiked. The man who had slid the blank board across Isaiah's desk in silence was the same one who had planted the seed to bury Nia, the same who orchestrated public humiliation under the guise of professionalism, and the same who, according to the group chat logs, had once written, "Students don't need trauma to learn, but a little fear keeps the tone intact." Isaiah backed away from the screen, jaw clenched, air thin around him. Everything had led here. Every page, every file, every silence, it all pointed to a deliberate, coordinated pattern of soft violence, carried out not through fists or expulsion slips, but through data manipulation, counseling narratives, and coded language. It was brilliant in its cruelty, quiet, institutional, and fatal to any black student who dared to be visible without permission. The flash drive wasn't just proof, it was the blueprint of a system designed to destroy. As Isaiah encrypted the files, he realized Gavin had done more than betray his privilege. He had shattered the school's narrative from the inside. But the cost was inevitable. Gavin's scholarship, his family's influence, his social standing, all of it would become collateral the moment this went public. Still, Gavin had said nothing. He didn't need to, because for once, action had spoken louder than complicity. As Isaiah closed the last folder, one hidden file blinked into view, not part of Gavin's collection, but auto-synced from a cloud archive. It was titled, Referral Ningia Carrollton, PDF, and the sender field wasn't from Madison River Prep, but from a private psychiatric facility across state lines. The file's name alone, Referral Ningia Carrollton, to TDF, landed in Isaiah's chest like a steel weight. Until that moment, Nia had been a mystery suspended in silence, a vanishing without explanation. She was spoken of in shadows, referenced only by those brave enough to remember. But now, she had a paper trail, a cold, clinical referral from a psychiatric facility 2 states away. Not a suspension notice, not a transfer request. A formal submission to institutionalization. The PDF opened with language that stung even in its professional tone. Patient referred for behavioral instability, paranoia, refusal to comply with academic expectations. Isaiah read each word slowly, registering how the words were stitched together to sound medical, when they reeked of manufactured narrative. The document included background from the school. Student exhibited unprovoked hostility during staff interactions, expressed distrust in academic structures, and raised unsupported accusations against faculty. Nowhere was her name accompanied by concern, care, or even curiosity. She had been diagnosed with disruption and silenced through strategy. What chilled Isaiah most wasn't the language. It was the date. The referral had been filed 48 hours after Nia had posted a now-deleted blog entry titled, My Education is Not a Cage. Though the post had vanished from the web within hours, some students remembered it. A few had screenshotted fragments. In it, she'd written about how her questions in class were treated as threats, how teachers often smiled while clipping her wings, and how authority had a polite way of pushing students like her to the margins, only to blame them when they disappeared. And disappear. She did. No goodbye. No explanation. No assembly. No counselor check-in. Just silence. She vanished from yearbooks, her name removed from class rosters. Teachers referred to her only when discussing case sensitivity. Students who asked were told it wasn't their business. And in time, the silence did its job. She became a ghost. But now, Isaiah had a destination. The psychiatric facility was real. Private. Expensive. A place known for executive youth wellness. A phrase that disguised isolation under the mask of therapy. He searched through encrypted alumni forums, backdoor channels, and eventually found an old server that contained Nia's original blog metadata. Her username wasn't anonymous. It was tied to an email address buried in a forgotten school project folder. That address was still active. Isaiah wrote once, then again, no reply. Then, on the third day, at 2:16 a.m., a response appeared. It was brief. Careful. I know who you are. I've seen what you've posted. I know what they did, but I won't talk unless it's in my voice. No more other people speaking for me. You want the truth? Then let me tell it myself. No signature, just a condition. She would speak, but on her terms. Isaiah stared at the screen. The request wasn't about control. It was about reclamation. For so long, Nia's story had been filtered through files, accusations, silence, and second-hand whispers. Now, she wanted to break that chain. She didn't want to be evidence. She wanted to be heard. Isaiah agreed. He replied with a single line, You choose how. I'll listen. She answered the next night. Nia didn't want to meet in person. She didn't trust Madison River. Not the school. Not the town. She had left everything behind and wasn't coming back. But she offered something better. A recorded testimony. Her own voice. Her own word. A story that could finally thread the broken pieces together. The file arrived the next evening.
No edits. No music. Just her voice.
She introduced herself plainly. Said her full name. Her grade. Her GPA. Her leadership roles. Then she paused. And what followed was a confession carved from pain. She spoke of how the school celebrated her during Black History Month, asked her to pose for photo ops, and featured her on the website, but never gave her real agency. She explained how her suggestions in class were ignored until repeated by white peers, how teachers called her bold in public, but described her as intense in private, how her scholarship was treated like charity, not merit, how she once overheard a counselor say she was the right face for a diversity brochure, but a dangerous thinker. But it was her accusation against Mr. Carraway that silenced Isaiah. She had confronted him about biased grading. Not publicly, not with anger, just a request to understand why her essays were consistently marked as unclear. even when other students praised them. His response was calm, condescending. He told her she lacked perspective, that maturity takes silence, that if she didn't like the way the institution worked, perhaps she wasn't ready to be here. She reported the exchange. That's when the machine activated. She was suddenly pulled from clubs. Her assignments flagged. Her counselor recommended a psychiatric review. Her teachers began commenting on her disengagement. The final blow was a staged incident, a mischaracterized confrontation in a study hall that was used to justify immediate referral for emotional distress. She never had a breakdown. They needed her to look broken, and so they broke her record. Isaiah sat frozen, the audio looping in his headphones. Nia's voice didn't crack. It didn't rage. It simply unfolded, steady and haunting. Her final words lingered. They didn't just silence me. They rewrote me. But I'm still here. And I'm watching now. The weight of her truth wasn't just evidence. It was liberation. Isaiah realized this wasn't just about exposing what happened to Nia. It was about undoing the machinery that allowed it to happen in the first place. He uploaded the file that night. Untouched, uncaptioned, full. Her story, in her voice. It detonated online within hours. Students gasped. Alumni returned. Journalists called. But inside the school, the panic didn't show in headlines. It showed in locked doors, security standing outside classrooms, and staff calling in sick. Then, at 7:04 a.m., Isaiah's inbox pinged again. Not from Nia. Not from Gavin. From someone using the email domain, madisonriverlegal.org. The email with the subject line "Immediate cease and desist, federal escalation pending," was written like a blade, precise, cold, and deliberately vague. It didn't mention Nia by name, nor did it reference the testimony Isaiah had posted. But every line screamed panic. It accused him of disseminating privileged institutional materials, warned of reputational harm, and hinted at intervention by higher legal bodies. But Isaiah didn't need to read between the lines. The school was shaking, not because of baseless rumor, but because someone they had erased had finally spoken, and the world was listening. Nia's testimony had landed like a thunderclap. Thousands had heard it. Educators, activists, former students, even national journalists were now watching with growing urgency. But behind the headlines and hashtags, Isaiah knew the public had only heard a fraction of the real story. What Nia said out loud was only the part she was willing to share. What she didn't say, what she gave to Isaiah off the record, was something darker, something the school had buried with precision and quiet violence. It began with a meeting she never asked for, one that was framed as routine mental health support, following what the administration described as emotionally erratic classroom behavior. Nia, at the time, had just returned from a district-wide leadership conference, where she had presented on systemic inequities in elite education. Her words, according to students who were there, were brilliant. But when she returned, everything changed. She was pulled from 2 of her honors courses without notice. Her advisor told her it was due to curriculum balancing, but her replacement classes were lower-level electives. Then came the first incident report, accusing her of hostile body language toward a faculty member. It was vague, the documentation flimsy, but it opened the door for intervention. The school nurse called her in that week, framing the visit as routine. She was offered tea, water, told she looked tired, told that pressure could be deceptive, that even high-achieving students sometimes needed help. Nia accepted a tablet handed to her, told it was a supplement, something to calm nerves. She took it without question. She trusted the people in that room. But within hours, everything began to blur. She described the feeling in her voice note to Isaiah, a slow fade of awareness, the soft haze of emotional dullness, like her own thoughts had stopped moving at their normal pace. Teachers claimed she had finally calmed down. Counselors noted her as cooperative, but Nia, inside, felt like a passenger, detached, compliant, her thoughts muffled, her passion muted. She later discovered, through a medical printout accidentally included in her file during a routine health update, that what she had been given wasn't a supplement. It was a low dose of an anti-anxiety medication, commonly prescribed, but highly controlled. She had never signed no documentation was sent to her parents. It was administered under discretionary support protocol. The fury that ignited in her after learning this was enough to break the fog. She confronted the administration with calm resolve. Demanded an explanation. Demanded her transcripts. Demanded to speak with her parents directly without an intermediary present. That's when the threats began. Her parents received a formal letter, not from the principal, but from the school's legal counsel, warning them of potential defamation exposure due to unsubstantiated allegations made by their daughter. It said that the school would be forced to consider withdrawal of academic privileges if Nia continued to disrupt operations with unsupported behavioral claims. They were advised to seek medical consultation. Her father, a military officer with no patience for public spectacle, told her to de-escalate. Her mother wept behind closed doors, begging her to just graduate quietly. They didn't understand this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a machine, and it had already been turned on. Nia tried to stay, but the system didn't need to expel her to erase her. Teachers stopped calling on her in class. Friends began avoiding her. Her essays were returned with passive-aggressive marks, labeled incoherent or too emotionally biased. She was removed from student council due to committee misalignment. One teacher accused her of fabricating past leadership participation. By the end of the month, she no longer recognized the reflection looking back at her. She withdrew quietly, left the state, enrolled in an alternative learning program online, using only partial credit transfers. Her academic record, once flawless, had been warped. Her reputation, once admired, was now a whisper of what happened. But she had kept one thing: evidence. Not just the medical note. Not just the email threats, but audio clips from a peer who had secretly recorded a faculty discussion during the month Nia was being reassessed. The clip was short but lethal. A teacher stated that if she doesn't stop rallying the others, we'll have to push the narrative a different direction. Another replied, "We can't let her become a martyr." The final voice, unmistakably Caraway's, said, "Sedate the storm, quietly, if we can." Isaiah listened to that clip a dozen times before uploading it. No names, just voices. He paired it with Nia's medical document, redacted but time-stamped, and released it alongside her now viral testimony. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was thunder waiting to break. Within 24 hours, a civil rights legal group reached out. Major networks began requesting interviews. And most importantly, former students began sharing their own incidents. The pattern wasn't just Nia's, it was the school's legacy. Invisible, until someone refused to be buried. But what Isaiah hadn't expected was the next message. It came not from the school, not from the media, but from the nurse, the same one who had given Nia the tablet. The message was short, cryptic, and chilling. "You're not the first student they sedated." And Nia wasn't the last. The nurse's message had not only confirmed Isaiah's worst fears, it had cracked something wider open. Her words weren't written with emotion, just bone-deep finality. "You're not the first student they sedated." And Nia wasn't the last. It wasn't just a warning, it was a confession. One that came too late for some, but just in time for what Isaiah was about to do next. By then, the school had buried itself in silence. Administrators stopped responding to media inquiries. Internal memos were leaked, suggesting teachers suspend all commentary on recent digital disruptions. Students whispered in corners. Parents flooded email chains. And yet, not a single voice from the institution stood before a camera. Not one. They thought waiting would smother it. Isaiah knew better. Silence wasn't strategy anymore. It was surrender. At 7 p.m. that Thursday evening, he posted a single graphic, a countdown timer over the words "unseen," "unedited," "unstoppable." Beneath it, "Live at 9." There was no explanation, no teaser, just those 3 words. But in the era of exposure, that was enough. By 8:30, the livestream link had over 100,000 shares. By 8:50, the countdown had been embedded into student group chats across the country. By 9:00, nearly 1 million viewers had tuned in. The screen opened to darkness. Then, slowly, Isaiah's face came into frame. Not dramatic, not stylized. Just him, quiet, composed. Behind him, a wall covered in printed documents, post-its, screenshots, and photos. The kind of backdrop that said this wasn't a stunt. It was a reckoning. He started with a story. Not his own. Not her pain, her erasure. Isaiah played the full testimony. Uncut. Raw. Every pause. Every breath. Every word. It wasn't the data that stunned the audience. It was her voice. Clear, restrained, but irreversible. Viewers flooded the comment stream with heartbreak, outrage, disbelief. Some students began screen recording in real time. Others posted clips with captions, like she was real. They made her disappear. Then, Isaiah pivoted to the documents. Each file was shown on screen. The altered records, the drug administration logs, the surveillance camera screenshots of staff planting devices in lockers, and the email threats that followed. He didn't just flash them, he explained them how they were used, what they meant, and how subtle their damage could be when wrapped in institutional language. Then came the evidence of group chats. The jokes, the slurs, the ranking systems. Each one burned a layer of the school's clean image. Viewers saw not just what was done, but how it was hidden. How racism wore suits, how it signed off on policy, how it labeled defiance as disorder and made compliance a prerequisite for survival. Then the twist. Isaiah brought in others. The screen split. Faces began appearing. Alumni from across the country, each from different graduating classes, different years, but with the same story. Each had a minute to speak. No long speeches, just facts. A pattern of bias, retaliation, and gaslighting. It was orchestrated like a chorus of ghosts, finally demanding to be counted. The viewership passed 2 million, then 3. Celebrities started retweeting the stream. Journalists flooded the chat. A former Department of Education official requested to speak off record, but Isaiah didn't flinch. This wasn't about noise. This was about proof. As the stream reached its peak, Isaiah returned to the moment it all began. The blank board. He explained what it really meant. How it wasn't just a test. It was a dare. An insult dressed as a challenge. A way to humiliate a black student without a single slur or raised voice. And how by walking out, he hadn't disobeyed. He had exposed. The chat exploded with support. But the story wasn't finished. He ended with one final reveal. A side-by-side comparison of Madison River's publicly available diversity reports versus the internal records leaked by the former vice principal. The discrepancies were staggering. Whole demographic categories omitted, graduation stats manipulated, transfer reasons marked as voluntary when they were forced. It wasn't just one student they'd failed. It was a decade of deception. And just as he was preparing to close the stream, a ripple appeared in the chat. Viewers began typing, "They're there. Police just walked in. What's happening?" Then, without warning, Isaiah's live stream glitched. The image froze for a moment. The comment section locked. The viewer count stalled. The screen jolted back. Isaiah was still live, still speaking. But now, in the distance, there was motion. People could be seen outside the window. A shadow moved behind the curtain. Then the lights flickered. He paused for the first time all night. No fear in his face. Just resolve. But the message was clear. As the screen pixelated, a notification slid across the top. Your location has been flagged by a third-party report. Emergency response en route. XD line. Immediate cease and desist. Federal escalation. Pending. The last seconds of the live stream weren't dramatic. They were surgical. A flicker. A pause. A frozen screen with Isaiah's expression locked mid-thought. Lit only by the glow of a laptop screen. An attention that no pixelation could blur. For the millions watching, the interruption looked like a technical glitch. For Isaiah, it was a warning too late. They had found him. The knock came heavy, not rushed, not panicked, but rehearsed, measured. A strike masked in procedure. Isaiah never opened the door. It was forced. He didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He knew the cameras, both his own and the millions that had witnessed his digital truth, were already rolling in the minds of those who mattered. But when the officers stepped into the room, hands firm but without excessive force, what disturbed Isaiah most wasn't their presence. It was the paperwork they carried. Official. Authorized. Sealed. The charges read: unlawful cyber harassment of educational professionals. Defamation with malicious intent. Breach of digital privacy. The document named him as the aggressor, not the exposer, not the whistleblower, but the threat. He was cuffed, escorted out. No Miranda, no warning, just a silence thicker than metal, and a hallway too quiet for what it was holding. Outside the building, cameras flashed, not media, surveillance. It wasn't just about removing him, it was about framing him. The police car drove him not to a local precinct, but to a holding station near the county courthouse. Not one designed for danger, but for high-profile containment. There was no public record of his detainment, at least not yet. The intention was clear: scrub him offline before he became too loud to erase. But they were too late. The stream hadn't just reached viewers. It had been backed up, mirrored, re-uploaded, copied to platforms across the internet. Students had saved screen recordings. Activists had clipped segments for TikTok and embedded them into news breakdowns. Alumni networks flooded group chats with reaction threads. The truth had mutated into momentum. Inside the sterile holding cell, Isaiah sat alone. No clock. No window. Just the hum of a light overhead, and the weight of what had been set in motion. Then, the noise began. Outside the courthouse. It started small, just a few voices. Then it grew. Dozens. Hundreds. By noon, a crowd had formed, holding signs chanting his name. A protest without prior planning. Organized not by flyers, but by fury. What Madison River Prep hadn't accounted for was the speed of outrage in the digital age. How quickly truth could ferment into resistance. Within 24 hours, 3 national outlets had run segments titled "Student Arrested After Exposing School's Racist Practices." Isaiah's face, once used on the school's scholarship page as proof of inclusive excellence, now led primetime news blocks as a symbol of institutional retaliation. But still, the legal machine moved. A statement was issued from the school, not to apologize, not to explain, but to clarify that Isaiah had disseminated internal confidential staff communications, obtained unlawfully, and knowingly caused emotional harm to several faculty members. The term they leaned on was digital bullying, a phrase clean enough for headlines and sharp enough for headlines. What they hadn't anticipated was the next twist. That evening, as Isaiah remained in holding, a local bail fund posted his release amount on social media. Within minutes, small donations began pouring in. $10, $25, $50. Then came the tipping point. A single anonymous donor transferred $250,000, with one message attached. This isn't bail, it's the beginning. Within minutes, social media did what it does best: speculate. The internet dug in, traced the donation, matched details, and then the truth emerged in a quiet, explosive tweet from a verified account. A globally recognized musician, one known for philanthropy but rarely for politics, had made the donation, not with fanfare, but with fury. The artist posted only once, an image of Isaiah in handcuffs with the caption, "When you punish the truth, you prove it right." The post detonated. By morning, Isaiah was not just a trending hashtag, he was a headline. Justice for Isaiah. Expose Madison River. Listen to Tonia. News anchors discussed the implications of a minor being arrested for whistleblowing. Civil rights attorneys began calling out the misuse of defamation laws to silence youth activists. Law professors weighed in on how cyberbullying had become the newest weapon in administrative censorship. The backlash was massive. But behind the scenes, Isaiah remained still. He had been released under supervision, no ankle monitor, but with an agreement to remain offline during investigation. A condition Isaiah understood for what it was: not legal precaution, but strategic suppression. But what the school hadn't realized was that Isaiah didn't need to speak anymore. The files were still out there. The stream had been clipped, translated, and discussed across 5 continents. Students were staging walkouts in solidarity, tagging his name in protest signs and murals. Former teachers, once silent, had begun submitting anonymous affidavits to education watchdog groups, and parents, affluent, influential parents, were now questioning how many stories like Nia's were sitting beneath the surface. Madison River Prep had started with silence. They ended up detonating a generation. But as Isaiah sat in temporary release, watching the world move without him, he knew the final blow hadn't landed yet. Because buried within the files Gavin had given him, tucked behind layers of student performance charts and confidential notes, was something far more dangerous than bias or slurred. It was a spreadsheet, a list of scholarship applicants, flagged, ranked, marked, not just for academic review, but for long-term cultural impact risk. And one of the names on that list was a 7th grader. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, in faded font and red highlight, was a column labeled, "Flagged for future behavioral containment." The trial of Isaiah Creed was never supposed to reach a courtroom. It was meant to disappear under paperwork, buried in non-disclosure agreements, framed as a disciplinary matter between a school and a troubled student. But the moment Isaiah was arrested on camera and the donation from a global artist turned the narrative viral, everything shifted. The school's quiet containment strategy shattered. What began as a student-led exposé had snowballed into a full-fledged civil hearing, framed by constitutional lawyers as a test case for the criminalization of student whistleblowers and the systemic use of policy to cloak racial abuse. Outside the courthouse, chaos ruled. Protesters lined the barricades for days. Students, alumni, and educators from across the country arrived in buses, holding signs that bled rage and grief. "My education isn't a weapon," they silenced her. "We won't be next. We are all Isaiah." Every morning, reporters gathered like vultures at the steps, microphones extended as if proximity could give them clarity. But inside the courtroom, the silence was surgical. No slogans, no chants, just cold air and sharp eyes. Every seat fit. Isaiah sat alone at the defense table. He wasn't surrounded by lawyers in flashy suits. He didn't come from generational power or institutional protection. Yet, in that room he wasn't small. He was unblinking. The same student they had once accused of disruptive tone now stood at the center of the nation's attention, with the composure of someone who had already lived through the worst and had nothing left to fear. The prosecution tried to simplify the story, painting Isaiah as an emotionally unstable teen who leaked confidential documents to humiliate his school and damage its standing within the academic community. They used terms like intent to defame, malicious exposure, and the ever-familiar phrase, cyberbullying. They even went as far as bringing forward teachers who had filed emotional trauma claims, tearful testimonies, hollow phrases, lines rehearsed for sympathy. But the defense team had been preparing something else entirely. With every witness called, Isaiah's legal team, a pair of young black civil rights attorneys, didn't just defend, they revealed. Each cross-examination unspooled another thread of the school's rot. A faculty member confirming quota pressure on scholarship admissions, a counselor admitting to being guided on how to file discipline notes, and a former administrator exposing risk ratings given to black students during freshman evaluations. The courtroom transformed from a place of judgment into a stage of exposure. Then came the witnesses from outside the school. Dozens of former students, from public schools, charter academies, and other private institutions, took the stand via video testimonies. One by one, they described experiences so eerily similar that patterns could no longer be dismissed as isolated. Stories of unjust suspensions for attitude, recommendation letters being withheld after advocacy, teachers labeling them uncoachable despite high performance. It was a chorus of systemic silence breaking open. But it wasn't until Nia's deposition played that the courtroom's atmosphere shifted from legal to historic. Her video testimony, aired uncut on the large screen, forced everyone in the room, including the judge, to confront the consequences of professional cruelty. She spoke not only of what had been done to her, but how it had been structured, normalized, even congratulated by her peers in whispers. She described the quietness of being erased, while still physically present. She didn't cry. She simply named what they had done, and what they had almost gotten away with. The room was breathless. Isaiah watched the screen, but his eyes weren't on Nia. They were on the faculty seated at the prosecution's bench. Mr. Carraway sat with arms crossed, trying to look unaffected, but his hands fidgeted. The man who had once slid a blank board across Isaiah's desk like a smirk now looked trapped in a narrative he couldn't write. Then came the twist. Mid-trial, an anonymous drop landed in the judge's chambers, delivered by a local education watchdog group. Inside the folder were files labeled Containment Predictive Matrix 2. A continuation of the earlier flagged spreadsheet, this one updated post-Isaiah's exposure. The timestamps proved it had been edited recently. The school, rather than suspending the program, had restructured it quietly, renaming the categories, but keeping the same system intact. In the files, a chilling notation was discovered. Monitor students whose siblings exhibit similar non-compliant tendencies. This wasn't just institutional racism. This was generational surveillance. The courtroom erupted. Shouts, tears, disbelief. The judge called for order, banging the gavel hard enough to fracture silence. But the narrative could no longer be controlled. By the time closing arguments began, the case was no longer about whether Isaiah had broken rules. It was about how the school had used rules to break students. The prosecution tried once more to redirect, to claim reputation harm, institutional damage, but their voice drowned beneath the weight of exposure. Then, in a moment no one saw coming, the judge interrupted the closing statements. With calm, cold authority, she announced a pause in proceedings. She addressed the court not as a mediator of guilt, but as a representative of justice. She stated that the evidence presented had not only cast doubt on the claims against Isaiah, but raised constitutional questions about the misuse of administrative policy to target, contain, and erase black student voices under the banner of discipline. She paused, and then made a move no one expected. The judge announced she was issuing a federal referral, not against Isaiah, but against Madison River Prep itself, for potential civil rights violations, educational discrimination, and conspiracy to suppress protected speech. The moment the judge's gavel fell, and the charges against Isaiah were officially dismissed, the courtroom exhaled with a breath it hadn't realized it had been holding. It wasn't relief. It was release. The kind that echoed not just through the marble walls of the courthouse, but across classrooms, school districts, and legislative floors nationwide. Isaiah Creed, once framed as a defiant distraction, had not only been cleared, he had forced the system to look in the mirror. But it didn't end at dismissal. The judge's closing statement, calm, surgical, and damning, declared an immediate referral to federal investigators. Madison River Prep, an institution once hailed as a pinnacle of elite education, would now be under audit for possible violations of civil rights, racial discrimination, and obstruction of justice. The school's carefully preserved mask of excellence had cracked so violently that other schools felt the tremor. Within a week, headlines erupted. Federal probe into elite prep school opens doors to national audit. Isaiah Creed case sparks demands for transparency in private education. We are all Isaiah trends. Globally, as students rally against academic racism, Isaiah didn't return to school. He didn't have to. He became the curriculum. Universities cited his case in ethics seminars. Civil rights organizations asked him to speak at youth conferences. Educators, some in tears, reached out privately to confess how long they'd seen the rot, but feared retaliation. But none of that changed the truth Isaiah carried with him daily, that exposing injustice had come at a cost no student should ever be asked to pay. He had lost his transcript, his stability, his anonymity, but in return, he had ignited a revolution. Across the country, students in dozens of schools began organizing. Not just protests, audits. They demanded access to grading data, disciplinary records, and equity reports. What started in hushed whispers turned into coordinated walkouts. Students of color, long told to stay grateful, now stood in gymnasiums reading their testimonies out loud while cameras rolled. Teachers who had once smiled politely through bias were now being confronted with their own emails, their own recommendation notes. One school in Illinois shut down for 3 days after it was revealed that students of color had been placed on quiet track schedules without parent notification. Another in Virginia faced a lawsuit after students exposed a staff memo that described minority students as social liabilities. And in every rally, every panel, every trending video, Isaiah's name surfaced like a heartbeat. But he didn't speak much anymore. Not because he was afraid, because he understood now that the truth was no longer just his to tell. The movement had grown beyond him. He had lit the match. The fire belonged to everyone. Yet behind the scenes, the system had not surrendered. The Department of Education, under pressure from private lobbyists and donor networks, launched a balancing initiative, framed as an attempt to evaluate activism's impact on academic integrity. It was dressed in language that sounded progressive, but Isaiah recognized the blueprint. He had lived it. It was just another polished attempt to pull the reins back. He received an anonymous email with an internal DOE memo attached. The subject line read, "Preliminary Target List, Institutions with Student Disruption Histories." Madison River Prep was on it, but so were 17 other schools, all of them with recent student-led equity protests. The twist was buried deeper in the document. Isaiah's name appeared not in the footnotes, but in the analysis section. He wasn't labeled a student. He was categorized under instigation risk, national scale. 3 years ago, he had walked out of a classroom holding a blank whiteboard. Now entire federal agencies were designing policies to ensure no student ever did it again. The next morning, Isaiah's mailbox overflowed with threats. Not from trolls, from institutions. One school board issued a statement condemning individuals who spread misinformation under the guise of justice. A private scholarship fund rescinded a grant offer. Anonymous operatives created online profiles with altered photos, fake transcripts, and edited versions of his live stream, meant to discredit his credibility. The erasure attempt had returned, not as silence but as distortion. But this time, Isaiah wasn't alone. The student who had once been ignored, humiliated, and handcuffed had become a symbol, and symbols don't break easily. An alumni-run tech firm reached out, offering cybersecurity support. A journalist who had covered the civil rights beat for 2 decades offered full legal protection for anything Isaiah wanted to release. More importantly, students, younger ones, in middle school and early high school, began sending letters, some handwritten, some typed. Each one began the same way.
"I didn't know we were allowed to speak until you did." Isaiah read every one. He archived them, printed some, hung a few on his bedroom wall. But one letter stopped him cold. It was from a 7th grade girl in New York, enrolled at a school that appeared on the same instigation risk list. Her name was Dahlia. Her older brother had been expelled 2 years ago after challenging a teacher's racial comments. Her parents never fought it. They feared what fighting would cost.
In her final line, she wrote, "They told me to never raise my hand too high, but now I know what happens if I don't." That was the moment Isaiah understood that this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of someone else's. He didn't post her letter online. He didn't exploit her pain. He wrote her back. Not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as someone who had once needed to know he wasn't alone. Still, even in this rising tide of solidarity, Isaiah knew the next battle wasn't in a courthouse or a classroom. It was policy. It was the cold, invisible machinery of law. And as national hearings were proposed to evaluate student activism's effect on educational environments, Isaiah was quietly named as a witness, not by activists, not by his defense team, but by federal counsel, selected as an example of narrative escalation through digital platforms. The institution wasn't just afraid of Isaiah anymore. It was preparing to neutralize him. 1 week before his scheduled testimony, Isaiah received a secure envelope. Inside was a confidential report stamped Interto only. DO. The headline: Proposed Legislation. Student Whistleblower Suppression Act. Draft Review. If you believe no student should ever be silenced, erased, or told to prove they belong, type yes in the comments. What would you have done if that blank board was slid in front of you? Subscribe for more stories that expose what others try to hide, because silence protects injustice, and we're here to break it.